Correggio, Italy. The winter of 1939. The women who visited Leonarda Cianciulli's kitchen that season remembered it the way people remember warmth when they have been cold for a long time. The shop she ran from the ground floor of her house was a gathering point for the neighborhood, a place where you could buy things you needed and also sit for a while and be listened to, which in a small northern Italian town in the second year of the Second World War was worth more than most things you could buy. Leonarda was 45 years old. She was stout and dark-haired and moved through her kitchen with the efficiency of a woman who had been cooking since she could reach the stove. She told fortunes on the side, reading palms and cards, and was considered by her neighbors to have a genuine gift for it. She was warm. She was practical. She was, by every account the neighborhood would later produce, the kind of woman you were glad to know. The tea cakes she served that winter were exceptional. Her neighbors said so. Crunchy, sweet, with a depth of flavor that distinguished them from anything else she had made. She served them to the women who came to visit, to friends who stopped in on their way home from the market, to anyone who sat down long enough to be offered a plate. She ate them herself. She gave some to her son Giuseppe. Nobody asked for the recipe. In the way of neighborly courtesy, people did not ask for recipes from women who clearly had a gift. They simply ate, and complimented her, and went home, and thought nothing more of it. The tea cakes were made from blood. The blood belonged to Faustina Setti, a woman of late middle age who had come to Leonarda in the autumn of 1939 seeking help in finding a husband. She had visited several times over several months, sitting in that same kitchen, drinking the wine that Leonarda offered, discussing the man in polo that Leonarda had told her was waiting. She had written the letters Leonarda instructed her to write, letters to her friends and family describing her departure for Pola, to be posted once she arrived, so that no one would worry. She had told no one where she was really going, as Leonarda had asked. And on December 17, 1939, she had come for the last time, to say goodbye before the journey, and Leonarda had given her a glass of wine, and the wine had been drugged, and when Faustina Setti fell unconscious Leonarda had killed her with an axe. The body went into a pot with 7 kilos of caustic soda. The blood went into a basin. The basin went into the oven, where the blood dried and was ground into powder and mixed with flour and sugar and chocolate and eggs and milk and a little margarine, and the mixture was kneaded until it was right, and then it was baked. The neighbors ate the tea cakes and said they were excellent and went home thinking nothing of it. This is the story of Leonarda Cianciulli, of a woman who killed 3 people in her kitchen in a small Italian town and served them to the people around her, and was not suspected for a year, and confessed when she was caught with a thoroughness and a calm that suggested she had been waiting to tell someone all along. Of the belief system that produced the killings, which was not madness in any clinical sense but something stranger and more specifically human. A faith in the transaction between sacrifice and protection, in the idea that life could be traded for life, that 3 deaths given could prevent 1 death taken. And of the question that her case has sat with since 1940, still not fully resolved. Whether Leonarda Cianciulli believed what she said she believed, or whether the belief was the story she told herself and eventually told the court, and the truth was something simpler and darker and more difficult to look at directly. Before I continue, if you're still here, you're exactly who this channel is made for. Subscribing to Glen genuinely keeps me going. It takes 1 second and it means more than you'd think. Leonarda Cianciulli was born on April 18, 1894, in the town of Mornella in the Campania region of southern Italy, the child of a union that should not have happened. Her mother, Emilia di Nolfi, had been forced to marry Mariano Cianciulli after pregnancy that was not chosen. In 1894, in a Catholic southern Italian village, the mechanisms available for addressing such a situation were limited, and marriage was the one that preserved the most appearances. The marriage was not a happy one. Leonarda entered it as the visible evidence of something her mother had not wanted, and her mother did not forget this. The relationship between them was marked throughout Leonarda's childhood by a coldness that periodically expressed itself as explicit hostility. She was the child her mother had not wanted, and her mother made this known in ways that accumulate over years into a particular kind of damage. The damage expressed itself early. Leonarda attempted suicide twice before she reached adulthood. The records are imprecise about the method and circumstances, noting only that the attempts occurred at around the age of 13, and that she survived them. In a culture where such things were not discussed and not documented except incidentally, 2 suicide attempts before the age of 18 tells you something substantial about the severity of what she was carrying. She also, from an early age, sought out fortune tellers. This requires some context to understand properly. The Italy that Leonarda grew up in, particularly in the rural south of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, existed in a space where Orthodox Catholicism and folk belief coexisted in ways that the Church periodically objected to and was never fully able to close. The village wise woman who read cards and palms existed alongside the priest who administered sacraments, and most of the people who consulted both did not experience this as a contradiction. The malocchio, the evil eye, was real. Curses were real. The predictions of fortune tellers were real, or real enough that people organized their behavior around them. This was not ignorance or credulity in a simple sense. It was a complete and coherent alternative framework for understanding causation, one that had been passed down through generations and been reinforced by enough apparent confirmations to sustain itself. Leonarda inhabited this framework completely. Before she married, she consulted a fortune teller who told her she would have children but that all of them would die young. She also, at some point, visited a Romani palm reader who studied her hands and told her, "In your right hand I see prison. In your left, a criminal asylum." She remembered both predictions. She carried them through everything that followed. In 1917, at the age of 23, she married Raphael Pansardi, a registry clerk, against the explicit wishes of her family, who had identified a wealthier match for her. Her mother's response to the marriage, by Leonarda's consistent account across all subsequent statements and the memoir she wrote in prison, was a curse pronounced on the wedding day, not a formal ritual but the kind of maternal pronouncement that in that culture carried a weight beyond the verbal. Whether the curse was metaphysically real is not the relevant question. Whether Leonarda believed it was real is. She did. She believed it with the completeness of someone who had received it from the one person in the world who would know how to mean it. The marriage moved to Lauria in 1921, Raphael's hometown in the province of Potenza. The children began to arrive and die. The fortune teller's prediction started, year by year, to confirm itself. A miscarriage. A child who did not survive infancy. Another. The losses accumulated with a consistency that, for a woman who had been told to expect exactly this, would have felt less like random tragedy and more like the execution of a sentence already pronounced. In 1927, while living in Lauria, Leonarda was convicted of fraud. The specific nature of the fraud is described in the records as the falsification of documents, likely connected to financial transactions at a workplace. She served a prison sentence, was released, and the family relocated, first to Lacedonia, then, after the 1930 Irpinia earthquake destroyed their home there, to Correggio in the north of Italy. The fraud conviction is worth noting, because it establishes something about Leonarda that the warmth of her Correggio reputation sometimes obscures. She was capable of deliberate deception for financial gain. She had done it before, been caught, served time, and moved on. She was not an innocent woman who arrived at violence without precedent. She was a woman with a history of calculated dishonesty who had also experienced extraordinary loss and who had organized both her character and her understanding of her fate around a framework of prediction and curse and exchange. These things coexisted in her. They would eventually combine. By the time the family settled in Correggio in the early 1930s, Leonarda had lost 13 children and survived 2 suicide attempts and carried the predictions of 2 fortune tellers and her mother's curse as the explanatory framework for her life. She opened a small shop. She became a respected figure in the neighborhood. She sold things people needed and listened to their troubles and read their fortunes with a genuineness that her neighbors consistently described as a real gift. She was warm. She was practical. She was the kind of woman you went to when something in your life needed fixing. She also had 4 surviving children, and toward each of them she directed an intensity of protective feeling that her neighbors described as admirable and that was, in reality, something closer to desperate. The fortune teller had said they would all die. 13 had died. 4 remained. She had been unable to protect the 13. The 4 she would protect by any means available to her. Giuseppe was the eldest and her favorite. He was born in 1922, which meant he was 17 when the war began to gather. He was the one she had organized her remaining maternal energy around. When he told her, in late 1939, that he intended to join the Royal Italian Army, the full weight of everything she had been carrying, the fortune teller's prediction, the 13 deaths, the curse, the sacrifice logic she had been constructing from the materials available to her, came to bear on a single point. She was going to lose him, unless something changed the terms. The logic of sacrifice, the exchange of one life to preserve another, the offering given to prevent the catastrophe, is as old as the record of human religious practice. It appears in the oldest texts of every tradition, is condemned in most of them by the period of their consolidation, and persists in folk practice and folk belief long after the official condemnations. Leonarda had absorbed it from the culture she had grown up in, the same culture that had told her about curses and the evil eye and the significance of what a fortune teller sees in your palm. She had assembled from these materials a personal theology of exchange, and when the situation demanded an offering, she knew the terms. 3 lives. 3 sacrifices. 1 for each of the critical transitions of a life, perhaps, or simply 3 because 3 had the weight of the sacred number in the religious framework she inhabited. The records do not specify why 3 specifically. Leonarda, in her memoir and in her trial testimony, does not explain the arithmetic. She simply describes having arrived at the conclusion that 3 sacrifices were required, and then describes finding 3 victims. What is notable, looking at the 3 women she chose, is how completely she exploited the trust that her position in the community had generated. She was the woman people came to when they needed help. The woman who told fortunes and listened to problems and sometimes knew someone who could help with what you were looking for. Each of the 3 victims came to her specifically because they needed something she had told them she could provide. Each of them was in a vulnerable position, wanting a husband, wanting work, wanting a return to a former life. Each of them trusted her with the secrecy that their supposed opportunity required. Each of them wrote the letters she told them to write. Each of them came to say goodbye and drank the wine she offered. The trust was not incidental. The trust was the method. It was the thing she had built over years in the community of Correggio, and it was the thing she spent with each killing. 3 lives, and the trust of 3 women, and the reputation of the warm neighbor with a gift for understanding what people needed. Faustina Setti was the first. She was 65 years old, a spinster who had lived alone in Correggio for many years. She had spent her adult life watching other women marry and raise families, and the loneliness of that particular position in a small Italian town in the 1930s is not difficult to imagine. When Leonarda told her she had identified a suitable man in Pola, Faustina believed her with the completeness of someone who has been waiting a long time for exactly this kind of news. She brought her life savings, approximately 30,000 lire, to fund her new beginning. She wrote the letters Leonarda instructed her to write, describing her imminent departure for Pola, to be posted once she arrived. She told nobody where she was really going, because Leonarda had explained that discretion was necessary for these things to work out. She came to Leonarda's kitchen on December 17, 1939, to say goodbye before the journey. Leonarda gave her a glass of wine. The wine was drugged. Faustina lost consciousness. Leonarda killed her with an axe, dragged the body into a closet, and cut it into 9 pieces, collecting the blood in a basin. She described all of this in her memoir with the same matter-of-fact precision she brought to the descriptions of cooking. The body went into a pot. 7 kilos of caustic soda went in with it. The mixture was stirred until the pieces dissolved into what she described as a thick, dark mush, which was poured into buckets and emptied into a nearby septic tank. The blood was dried in the oven, ground into powder, mixed with flour and sugar and chocolate and eggs and milk and margarine, kneaded together, and baked. The tea cakes were served to visitors. Giuseppe ate some. Leonarda ate some. The neighbors said they were excellent. This is the passage in Leonarda's memoir that every account of this case returns to, and it returns to it because there is no other way to convey what it contains. She wrote about the tea cakes with the same voice she used to describe everything else in the document. No register shift. No hesitation. The blood in the basin, dried and ground, mixed with the other ingredients, baked until crunchy. She served them to the ladies who came to visit. They were good. The ladies enjoyed them. These sentences exist in the historical record in Leonarda's own handwriting, and they have been sitting there since the 1940s, and there is still no adequate response to them. The interval between the first and second killings was approximately 9 months. What Leonarda experienced during those months is not recorded in the memoir, which treats the intervals between killings as gaps to be crossed rather than periods to be described. What is known is that Giuseppe left for the army and did not die. For Leonarda, operating within her framework, this was confirmation. The first sacrifice had worked. The exchange had been completed and the protection had been granted. The logic had been validated. She needed two more. Francesca Soavi was 55 years old, a former schoolteacher. She had come to Leonarda for advice about her future. She was struggling, professionally and financially, and Leonarda had told her she had connections with a school in Piacenza that was looking for a teacher of Francesca's background. The process was the same as with Faustina. Write the letters. Tell nobody. Come for one last visit before the journey. On September 5, 1940, Francesca came to say goodbye. Leonarda gave her drugged wine. She killed her with the axe. The body was dissolved. The blood was dried and baked. Francesca Soavi became teacakes that were served to the neighborhood women who dropped by for a visit. The third victim was different in kind as well as in degree. Virginia Cacioppo was a woman of previous distinction. She had been a soprano, not a minor one, but a singer of sufficient talent and reputation to have performed at La Scala in Milan, the most celebrated opera house in Italy. She was older now, retired, living in Correggio in circumstances that did not match the life she had once had. She still carried the identity of a woman of culture and achievement, still introduced herself in terms of what she had been rather than what she was now. She was, in a specific way, trapped between a former self she could no longer inhabit and a present self she had not fully accepted. Leonarda told her she had identified an impresario in Florence who was looking for a secretary of cultural refinement, someone who understood the operatic world from the inside, who could be a genuine asset to a man of that kind. Virginia Cacioppo was, in the frame of this offer, exactly what was needed. She wrote the letters. She told nobody. She paid Leonarda 50,000 lire, more than either of the previous victims had brought, for the introduction and the arrangement. She came to Leonarda's kitchen on September 30, 1940, for the last time. The wine was drugged. The axe was used. The body went into the pot. But Virginia Cacioppo's fate was different from those of the two women before her in one specific and remarkable respect. Her body produced superior results. Leonarda wrote, "She ended up in the pot, like the other two. Her flesh was fat and white. When it had melted, I added a bottle of cologne, and after a long time on the boil, I was able to make some most acceptable creamy soap. I gave bars to neighbors and acquaintances. The cakes, too, were better. That woman was really sweet. That woman was really sweet." This sentence is the one that has been quoted in every account of this case since 1940, and the reason it keeps being quoted is that it keeps refusing to be processed. It is a sentence about soap and tea cakes that is also, simultaneously, a sentence about a person who had sung at La Scala and wanted a different life, and Leonarda wrote it with the same voice she used to describe everything, without apparent awareness that the register was catastrophically wrong, without any signal that she understood the difference between what she was saying and what a human being can be expected to absorb. The soap was distributed. Bars of Virginia Cacioppo, former soprano, given as gifts to the neighbors of Correggio, who used them, thinking nothing of it. The tea cakes were served. The neighborhood ate Virginia Cacioppo and said the tea cakes were particularly good this time. What ended it was not an investigation. It was not a rumor. It was not a suspicious neighbor noticing something wrong. It was a sister-in-law. Virginia Cacioppo's sister-in-law, Albertina Fanti, had noticed that Virginia had disappeared. The letters explained the disappearance. Virginia had written cheerfully about her departure for Florence, her new position, her excitement about returning to something like her former life, but Albertina had a feeling that did not correspond to the letters. Something was wrong. She could not name it precisely. Perhaps she knew Virginia well enough to recognize something false in the tone. Perhaps she simply could not reconcile the disappearance with anything Virginia had mentioned to her before. Perhaps it was the kind of knowledge that arrives before the evidence, the intuition that runs ahead of the proof. She reported her concern to the superintendent of police in Reggio Emilia. The investigation that followed was brief. The police knew that Virginia had been seen entering Leonarda's house on September 30th. They questioned Leonarda. She initially denied involvement. She maintained her denial with a composure that observers described as remarkable, the same composure she had brought to every interaction with her community throughout the year of the killings, the composure of a woman who had decided something completely and was not troubled by the decision. Then the police suggested that her son Giuseppe might be implicated, that he was under suspicion, that the investigation might extend to him. Leonarda confessed immediately and completely. This shift, from composed denial to instant total confession, triggered by a single specific threat, is one of the most illuminating moments in the entire case. It establishes, with more clarity than any other element of the record, what had governed every decision she had made. Giuseppe. His safety was the organizing principle. She had killed to protect him. She confessed to protect him again. The willingness to sacrifice herself for him was as absolute as the willingness to sacrifice 3 women for him. The logic was perfectly consistent throughout. Only the currency changed. She told the police everything. The full account. The names, the dates, the methods, the pot, the caustic soda, the teacakes, the soap. She described the deaths and their aftermath with the precision of someone who had processed what she had done into a narrative she had been carrying for a year and was now finally able to set down. She explained the reasoning. The sun. The fortune teller. The curse. The exchange. The protection that had been purchased and had worked. The police were encountering something that had no standard template. A woman who had killed 3 people in her kitchen, processed their remains into consumable products, distributed those products to her community, and was now explaining all of this with apparent clarity and no apparent distress, framing the entire sequence as an act of maternal love so complete that it had required 3 deaths to sustain it. The trial took place in Reggio Emilia in 1946, 6 years after the killings. The delay was a consequence of the war and the disruption to Italian civil institutions that followed it, a backlog of unaddressed cases, a justice system that had to reassemble itself after the collapse of the fascist state. Leonarda spent those 6 years in custody, and during them she wrote the memoir. The memoir is called An Embittered Soul's Confessions. It runs to over 700 pages. It covers Leonarda's life from her childhood in Mornella through the killings and her arrest. It describes the murders in the clinical, recipe-like detail that the extracts already quoted convey. It also describes her childhood, her mother, the curse, the fortune tellers, the 17 pregnancies, the 13 deaths. It describes her life in Correggio, the shop, the community, the neighbours who came to her with their troubles. It is a document of extraordinary range and completeness, written by a woman with an elementary school education while confined in a criminal asylum. The authorship of the memoir has been disputed by some scholars, who note that Leonarda's formal education was minimal and question whether she was capable of producing a document of this length and sophistication. Computational linguistic analysis conducted on the manuscript in more recent decades, comparing it against letters she wrote to Giuseppe during the same period, suggests that the writing reflects a consistent idiolect across both sets of documents, that the same person wrote both. The balance of current scholarly opinion holds that Leonarda wrote the memoir herself, possibly with some assistance in organization or final editing, but that the voice and the content and the extraordinary detail are genuinely hers. If this is correct, and the evidence suggests it is, then Leonarda Cianciulli spent the years between her arrest and her trial writing a 700-page account of everything she had done and why, voluntarily, from inside a criminal asylum, without being compelled. The memoir was her choice. The confession it extended was her choice. She did not fight the record. She created it. At the trial, she maintained the position she had held from the moment of her confession. She had done what she had done. She had done it for Giuseppe. She was not sorry, because Giuseppe had survived, and 3 lives offered had preserved 1 life. The exchange had been real and had worked. She did not present herself as a woman who had lost her mind. She did not present herself as a woman who had been wrong. She presented herself as a woman who had done what love required. The most remarkable moment of the trial came when the prosecutor was describing the disposal of the victim's remains. Leonarda interrupted him. He had a detail wrong. She corrected it. The contemporary account describes her gripping the witness stand rail with what the journalist called oddly delicate hands, her deep-set dark eyes gleaming with what he described as a wild inner pride, as she concluded her correction. "I gave the copper ladle, which I used to skim the fat off the kettles, to my country, which was so badly in need of metal during the last days of the war." She had donated the ladle to the wartime metal collection drive. This fact was, for Leonarda, apparently relevant to the account of what had happened in her kitchen. She had done her civic duty. She had contributed to the war effort. The ladle had been useful for the bodies and then useful for the country. These things existed in the same sentence, in the same tone, without apparent awareness that they might produce different responses in the people hearing them. The court found her guilty. The sentence was 30 years in prison and 3 years in a criminal asylum. The fortune teller had said, "In your right hand I see prison. In your left, a criminal asylum." The sentence had fulfilled both predictions simultaneously, in the order specified. The pot in which the victims had been dissolved was taken as evidence. After the trial it was donated, along with other implements from the case, to the Criminological Museum in Rome. It is still there. Visitors to the museum can see it in a glass case. It is an ordinary cooking pot. Large, but not unusually so for a kitchen in which soap had always been made commercially. It could have been found in any kitchen in northern Italy in 1940. Leonarda served her sentence. She died of cerebral apoplexy on October 15, 1970, in the Women's Criminal Asylum in Pozzuoli, at the age of 76. Her body was returned to her family for burial. Her belongings were returned. The pot was not returned. The pot stayed in the museum. Giuseppe survived the war. He survived it without, as far as the record establishes, any knowledge during the war itself of what had been done to preserve his life. At what point he learned the truth, whether from the news of his mother's arrest in 1940, from the trial in 1946, from the memoir that circulated in Italy in subsequent years, is not documented. What the record establishes is that he lived. 3 women did not. Whatever he made of the arithmetic of that, he made it privately. The neighbours who ate the tea cakes and used the soap were never formally notified, as individual people, of exactly what they had consumed. The facts of the case were public from the time of Leonarda's arrest. The newspapers in Reggio Emilia and across Italy covered the story. The specific fact that she had distributed the processed remains to the community was part of the published record. The neighbours of Correggio knew. What they did with the knowledge, whether they could locate, in memory, the specific tea cakes they had eaten or the specific bars of soap they had used, whether they allowed themselves to make those specific connections or found ways to avoid them, the record leaves in the dark. It leaves it there, perhaps, for good reason. Some knowledge cannot be lived with in its full specificity. The community of Correggio had to keep living in Correggio. The tea cakes had been eaten years before anyone knew what was in them. There was nothing to be done. The only thing to do was what people do with the unbearable knowledge that arrives too late to act on: find a place to put it, and continue. Leonarda Cianciulli's case has a specific position in the catalogue of violence the 20th century produced. She killed 3 people. By the quantitative measures typically applied to such cases, this is not the largest number. What places her case in a distinct category is the combination of factors that surrounds the 3 deaths. The belief system that produced them. The domestic setting in which they were carried out. The community distribution of the remains. The confession that followed, full and detailed and unrepentant, written out across 700 pages with the voice of a woman who had done what love required and found the results satisfactory. The psychiatric evaluations at the time of her trial found her sane. Not sane in the colloquial sense of reasonable or rational, but sane in the clinical sense. She understood right from wrong as the law defined it. She understood the consequences of her actions. She was oriented to time and place and reality. The evaluating physicians described her belief system as delusional in the sense of a fixed false belief, but noted that outside of this specific domain she functioned coherently and intelligently. She was not psychotic. She was not disconnected from reality. She inhabited reality fully, and within that reality she had built a framework that accommodated murder as a reasonable response to a specific threat. The court sentenced her within the legal framework it had. The memoir she wrote placed the events within her own framework. The 2 frameworks do not translate into each other. They cannot be made to correspond. The court said she was guilty of murder. Leonarda said she had saved her son. Both things were true. The 3 dead women were the space between them. The 3 women she killed had been looking for something. Faustina Setti had wanted a husband, companionship, the domestic life that her community considered the proper shape of a woman's existence, and that she had been denied by circumstance rather than choice. Francesca Soavi had wanted work, the dignity of professional contribution, the sense of being useful, the income that independence requires. Virginia Cacioppo had wanted a return to a former self, the soprano who had sung at La Scala, the woman of culture and achievement, not the retired widow in the small town. Each of them had gone to Leonarda because she was the kind of woman you went to when you needed something. The warm neighbor. The practical friend. The one who listened and understood and sometimes knew someone who could help. The trust they brought her was the most complete kind, the trust of people who have been told good news they have been waiting a long time to hear, and who have no reason to doubt the person delivering it. Faustina Setti had no reason to suspect the husband was not real. Francesca Soavi had no reason to suspect the teaching job was not real. Virginia Cacioppo had no reason to suspect the impresario was not real. They wrote the letters. They kept the secrets. They came to say goodbye. They ate the wine. They lost consciousness. They did not wake up. What the case of Leonarda Cianciulli demonstrates, among other things, is the lethal potential of trust, specifically the trust that accumulates over years in a community, that comes from showing up consistently and reliably and warmly, that builds itself out of small acts of generosity and attention until it becomes the thing that makes you the person everyone turns to. That trust is a genuine good. It holds communities together. It makes it possible for people to help each other and be helped. It is one of the things that makes human life livable. It is also, in the wrong hands, a weapon of extraordinary precision. Because the person who has built that trust over years has access to the people who need it most, the lonely, the struggling, the hopeful, the ones who are looking for something and have not found it and are grateful when someone offers to help them look. And if that person has decided, for reasons that make complete sense within their own framework, that 3 of those people need to die, the trust is what gets them into the kitchen and keeps them there long enough to drink the wine. That is the particular horror of Leonarda Cianciulli. Not the axe. Not the pot. Not even the tea cakes, though the tea cakes are the detail that stays. The horror is the kitchen itself, warm, well-stocked, fragrant with things baking, and the face across the table, attentive and kind, asking how things are going, and already knowing how they will end. If you like this story, check out the ones on your screen. The dark algorithm thinks you'll enjoy these too.